I've come to a hesitant conclusion. Now that I have you here on the couch, I'm going to ask you. That Lincoln basically was a loner. And like an entertainer, he's on a stage. He keeps his audience, his colleagues and friends, even on circuit, at a psychological distance as he entertains them with stories, etc. And it goes into a bit of what Herndon said, that he thought more than any man I ever knew. That would give credence to someone wanting to be alone, wishing to be there, wishing to go through the thoughts that he had. And many who knew him said they didn't know him. They really didn't. There was that distance. Lamon, in Holland's book, I'm going to say something else that he said in there, in response to Holland saying that he loved all, Lamon wrote in, Lincoln loved no one living, but he was kind to all. Now, these things tend toward maybe the loner sort. Mm-hmm. Give me your thoughts.
Lincoln was capable of friendship, and he had a wide circle of friends, but of deep, intimate friendship. The only one we know of that's well documented is with Joshua Speed. And he and Joshua Speed were very close friends. They exchanged letters in which Lincoln talks about his innermost feelings, his emotional life, but you get no such letters to other folks. And in his dealings with women, in his dealings with his wife, he was, unlike every other man you've ever heard of, he was emotionally reserved and uncommunicative. Let me repeat that. and Mrs. Lincoln felt that. She felt that there was a kind of reserve, and when he felt the most, he said the least, she said. And I think that frustrated her. I know, and I'm pretty sure it frustrated the other women in Lincoln's life. And I think that comes in part from Lincoln's early experience of death. That if you get close to people, they'll up and die on you. And you'll be terribly wounded and deeply hurt. And so it's best to protect yourself by not getting too close to anybody, lest they abandon you by dying on you. So it's understandable that Lincoln felt that way.
David Donald, one of your mentors, characterizes Lincoln as a reactive person. I see him personally as more proactive and taking charge of a situation. Sure, there's something that happens out there that makes him do that, but then he goes out to try to make something happen, whether it's in '54 to stop the spread of slavery, which he did, or others. Talk to me about that.
Well, I have the greatest respect for David Donald. David Donald took me under his wing when I was a freshman in college. He was extremely kind to me. He had me out to his house regularly. He made me his research assistant when I was a sophomore. I followed him to Johns Hopkins after he left Princeton to go there, worked with him at Johns Hopkins as a graduate student, and he couldn't have been more nurturant and kind and helpful. But I think he's wrong a lot about Lincoln. For example, he starts his book by saying that Abraham Lincoln, as a self-made man, was not concerned with his ancestry. Well, that's demonstrably false. He writes several letters to relatives saying, this is what I know about my family tree, what do you know? He told his Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, as soon as he was done with the presidency, he was going to write his family history. When he wrote 2 autobiographical sketches, one in 1859 and one in 1860, he spends a great deal of time talking about his Lincoln ancestry. And I think David, for whom I have the greatest, feel the greatest gratitude, fundamentally misunderstands Lincoln when he says he was essentially a passive president. He wasn't. He was not a passive man. Now, he was passive in his dealings with women, to be sure. But as president and as founder of the Republican Party, as a Whig activist, he was very assertive. And he helped found the Republican Party. He brought it together in Illinois. He worked hard to keep the National Republican Party in its formative stages united. Then as president, one of the striking features of Lincoln's presidency is his iron determination to win the war. He wasn't just sitting back and letting things happen to him. He was intervening in the war time and again because the generals that he chose and that were available proved inept.
And by telegraph too.
By telegraph, and sometimes he would actually just micromanage. You move here and you move there, and so he was very active and assertive, particularly in 1862. And time and again, his generals proved inadequate. And Lincoln was very shy at first about his lack of a military background, but he kept within a short period of time, he realized that he understood the general strategy of the war better than any of his generals, and he kept urging them to follow a policy of coordinated attacks on all fronts, and he couldn't get them to do it. And finally, it's only when he got Sherman and Grant and Sheridan and Thomas toward the end of the war who finally carried out the strategy that he had been trying to get his other generals to carry out, that he tended to step back a bit. But even so, he was still pretty active in recommending to Grant what should be done. And there are two telegrams to Grant that I think capture this steely determination of Lincoln to assert himself and to win the war. On one occasion, Grant writes to him and says, should I withdraw some of my troops from the Petersburg front? This was in the summer of '64. And come to Washington. And Lincoln says, no, you've got Lee cornered down there. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible. Well, this is kindly Abraham Lincoln, chew and choke as much as possible. And then, toward the very end of the war, in April of '65, Grant writes and says, General Sheridan says that if the thing is pressed, the war can be brought to an end. And Lincoln says, let the thing be pressed. Whoa.
Exactly.
So I don't think Lincoln was a passive president at all.
I'm going to ask you about habeas corpus and the closing of newspapers. What are your views on Lincoln's actions in that regard?
Well, I don't pretend to have done much original research on that particular question, but there's a very fine historian named Mark Neely who did a brilliant book called The Fate of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln and Civil Liberties, that won the Pulitzer Prize back in the early 1990s. And what Mark did was to move beyond the argument over whether or not the president was authorized by the Constitution to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, that is, to allow people to be arrested without any charges being brought against them. And the argument has traditionally been that Congress had the power to do that, and the president didn't, and the president usurped the power of Congress. That argument, Neely said, is of some interest, but was much more interesting was the question of who was actually arrested, and why were they arrested, and how long were they arrested, where were they arrested. And to answer those questions, instead of going back and trying to tease out meanings from the debates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Neely said, let's look at this huge collection of material in the National Archives. There's an enormous array of information about military commissions, and some of the people who were denied habeas corpus were tried by military commissions. And so there are thousands of those records in the National Archives, and no historian had bothered to look at them to answer these questions of what really happened, leaving aside the theoretical question of which branch has the power to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, what was actually done. And the traditional criticism of Lincoln had been by Democrats during the war and by critics of Lincoln after the war, was that he used the power to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus to suppress dissent. That Northern newspaper editors, Northern politicians, Northern critics of the administration were arbitrarily arrested, thrown in jail, merely for expressing their opinions. And Neely says, well, let's take a look at that. And so he goes through these thousands of cases, and what he finds is that almost none of the arrests were made north of the border states or the Confederacy itself. That almost all the people arrested were very close to this theater of war. And there were all kinds of offenses for which people were arrested when the military commissions were held that had nothing to do with the expression of opinion. They were blockade runners, they were engaged in trade with the enemy, they were deserters, they were draft dodgers, and the like. And almost none of them qualify as political prisoners who were arrested and jailed for expressing their political opinions. Now, there were a couple of headline cases. Clement Vallandigham, who was a former congressman from Ohio, was arrested by General Burnside. And he was tried by a military commission and condemned to spend the rest of the war in jail. Lincoln realized that this was a tremendous blunder on the part of Burnside, who was given to blunders. So to undo the status of martyr that had been accorded to Vallandigham by this impulsive arrest on the part of Burnside, Lincoln freed Vallandigham and sent him to the Confederacy. The Confederates didn't know what to
Didn't
do
want
with
him
him. so he comes
him
back
back
to Canada, and then he runs for governor of Ohio. So that was a case where somebody is arrested for expressing political opinions, but that was by a general in the field exercising poor judgment, and Lincoln had to undo the damage that was done by that poor judgment. And there were two newspapers suppressed, two really important newspapers that were briefly suppressed during the Civil War in New York. The New York World and the commercial, I forget the exact title, Commercial Advertiser, I think it was. And they were suppressed for a day because they printed a bogus proclamation with Lincoln's signature, which was very discouraging about the status of the war. And this was done by people who were trying to make a killing in the gold market, because they knew the price of gold would soar with this discouraging proclamation from Lincoln, and they had invested in gold and they thought they'd make a quick killing. Well, Lincoln was quite indignant that this proclamation, which was bogus, had been issued, and so the papers were suppressed, but for a day, and not for a prolonged period. And it wasn't because they expressed an opinion that was hostile to the administration, but they had printed misleading, very false and misleading information. So the record of the Lincoln administration during the Civil War is, the remarkable thing about it is not how often civil liberties were suppressed, but by how seldom they were suppressed, particularly compared to what happened during the quasi-war with France in 1798 and the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, with World War I when the Sedition Act led to the arrest of all kinds of people for expressing opinions, World War II when the Japanese Americans were incarcerated without any form of due process, during the Cold War with the McCarthy period. And yet the Civil War was the one where there was really lots and lots of espionage and sabotage and real danger. So that the notion that Lincoln behaved in a dictatorial and arbitrary fashion, I think, is misguided. And I say that based not so much on my own research, but on the remarkable research that Mark Neely did.